Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Rashu Christi live streaming event. My name is Daniel Maritz. I am the Rashu Christi Chapter Director at the University of Pretoria. Rashu Christi currently has 5 chapters in South Africa. Like I said, we have this one in Pretoria. We also have one at the Northwest University at the Potchefstroom campus. We have a Rashu Christi chapter at Stellenbosch University, one at Rhodes University, and then also one at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Pietermaritzburg. Now, if you want to know anything else about Rashu Christi, feel free to visit our website at www.rashuchristi.co.za. On there, you will find all the relevant information to our ministry. We are a campus apologetics ministry where we seek to equip Christian students to be able to give historical, philosophical, scientific, and theological reasons for following Jesus Christ, and also to equip them to engage better with the ideas in the culture around them in a way that they are able to diagnose these ideas with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, we do these online events on a weekly basis. And so as you've probably noticed, tonight we'll do a first part, and then next week on Tuesday evening, same time, we will do part 2. And I am looking forward to tonight, and especially I want to welcome our guest this evening. His name is Dima Rozet from Russia. He is a very good friend of Rashu Christi. He has visited South Africa in the past. He was one of our speakers at the Rashu Christi Symposium in 2019, where he joined us. He is involved with a ministry called the Centers for Apologetics Research, and I'm sure he will be able to give you more information on that ministry. And is also affiliated with the Lutheran Church in Russia. Now, Dima, it is very nice to see you, and welcome, and thank you for taking the time to come here and do this lecture for us this evening.
Thank you, Daniel. The pleasure is entirely mine. Okay, a few words of introduction. As Daniel said, my name is Dima or Dmitry Rozet. I am the senior research coordinator with the ministry, a Christian ministry called the Centers for Apologetics Research. It is an international network which basically does counter-cult apologetics since 1990s. It is one of the largest and the oldest evangelical counter-cult ministry in Russia. But we also have branches in South America, North America, Latin America, Western Europe, Russia, and Africa. So we are trying to reach people in as many languages as we possibly can. And today we're going to be talking about the Mormons, and they happen to be my first love. They were the first cult I've ever met in my life. So it is the topic that I am especially fond of. And as you probably see for yourself, English is not my native language. So please bear with me if I speak not clearly enough. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask them. So let's...
Dima, I'm just quickly going to interrupt you.
Yeah,
and then
sure.
you just talked about the Q&A for the listeners out there. So as Dima said, feel free to ask questions in the live feed. We will, if there's time, get to that at the end of the lecture. And then the ministry where Dima is involved at, Centers for Apologetics Research, I've also added the link of that ministry in the description of this video. So feel free to follow the link as well if you want any more information there. All right, sorry, Dima, then it's all over to you now.
Sure. And our website, www.thecenters.org, is in English. So you will not have to struggle with Russian. That'll be available to you. Okay, let's go to our presentation, which happens to be the Book of Mormon. Today, let me open the first slide and I'll go on from there. Okay, you can see it's the Book of Mormon chapter, or part one, which means that we're going to continue on our conversation in a week from now. And today we're going to be talking about some basic things, some fundamental issues about the Book of Mormon. And next Tuesday, Lord willing, we'll be talking about more specific stuff like contradictions in the Book of Mormon and contradiction between the Book of Mormon and the historic Christian doctrine. So before we actually begin, let me tell you this. The Book of Mormon has a very special place in the Mormon theology. And I probably correct to say that it is a key element of the Mormon doctrine. So if we manage to undermine the credibility of the Book of Mormon, then all of the Mormonism will pretty much go down like dominoes. So today we're tackling one of the most important things that pertain to the Mormon doctrine and history and life, actually Mormon identity. Okay, and let me begin with a kind of sarcastic quote that is taken from a book written by the famous American writer Mark Twain. Of course, he was not a Christian by any standard, and he was very sarcastic, even caustic man when it came to describing religion. And in one of his books, which is called Roughing It, which is pretty much like a travelogue, like a travel diary of his, in chapter number 16, he gives a pretty long and pretty detailed description of the Book of Mormon. And this book, this chapter begins with these couple of paragraphs. And although I do not exactly share Mark Twain's sarcasm about religion, I pretty much share his sentiment about the Book of Mormon in particular. I really do feel pretty much the same way when I'm reading the Book of Mormon. So let's see what it says. All men have heard of the book of the Mormon Bible, but few except the elect have seen it, or at least taken the trouble to read it. I brought away a copy from Salt Lake. That's Salt Lake City, the capital city of the Mormons. The book is a curiosity to me. It is such a pretentious affair, and yet so slow, so sleepy, such an insipid mess of inspiration. It is chloroform in print. If Joseph Smith composed this book, the act was a miracle keeping awake, Keeping awake while he did it was at any rate. If he, according to tradition, merely translated it from certain ancient and mysteriously engraved plates of copper, which he declares he found under a stone in an out-of-the-way locality, the work of translating was equally a miracle for the same reason. The book seems to be merely a prosy detail of imaginary history, with the Old Testament for a model, followed by a tedious plagiarism of the New Testament. The author labored to give his words and phrases the quaint, old-fashioned sound and structure of our King James's translation of the scriptures, and the result is a mongrel, half modern glibness and half ancient simplicity and gravity. The latter is awkward and constrained, the former natural, but grotesque by the contrast. Whenever he found his speech growing too modern, which was about every sentence or two, he ladled in a few such scriptural phrases as exceeding sore, and it came to pass, etc., and made things satisfactory again. And it came to pass was his pet. If he had left that out, his Bible would have been only a pamphlet. And again, he goes like that for another several passages, paragraphs, and you can read it for yourself. The book is, at least this chapter is available on the web. You can find it for yourself. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the history of the Book of Mormon. When we go back in history, we know that the Book of Mormon was actually created and printed in early 1800s. And according to the official story of the Mormon Church, Joseph Smith was given possession of the golden plates, which he translated and declared to be the Book of Mormon in 1827. And what he actually did, at least according to the official history of the Mormon Church, he translated those golden plates by the power of God, and he dictated that translation to a number of scribes. And those scribes, they concocted together a manuscript, which is colloquially called the original manuscript. Unfortunately, we only have about 28% of that manuscript remaining in our possession, where we don't really know where the rest of the manuscript is. So we can't really go back and check the veracity, the credibility of pretty much 3/4 of the text. Then, when Joseph Smith was about to publish this translation, he had one of his scribes, the man by the name Oliver Cowdery, to actually go over the translation and prepare it for printing. And the result of that is called the printer's manuscript, which is pretty much we have it pretty much in full. There are only 3 lines of the text missing. But there's one important thing that we need to remember. There is quite a bit of difference between the original text, at least the portion that we possess now, and the printer's manuscript in that portion, which corresponds to that portion of the original text that we have in our possession. Because Oliver Cowdery did not just copy the original manuscript, he also did some corrections. So when you try to verify the official text of the Book of Mormon, you don't really have the original to go to and to check if the text that the Mormon Church uses now is really the same text that was dictated by Joseph Smith to his numerous scribes. And we can't really verify that the text that went to the printer was an exact, or at least a good copy of the original translation. It could have been changed in a number of places. We have no way of verifying that because the original is pretty much lost, at least 3/4 of it. That's a really big problem. Okay, let's go ahead. And here you see the first printing of the Book of Mormon. You can see the name of the city, Palmyra, New York, and the date, 1830. So this is actually the first Book of Mormon ever printed in any language. At the end of the 20th century, the Mormon Church did a very good job, actually. They reprinted the exact facsimile of the very first printing of the Book of Mormon. And I believe the first reprint was in 1970, and it is being sold openly in the Mormon bookstores. So pretty much anybody can acquire a copy now and compare this ancient, very first printing of the Book of Mormon to the text that Mormons are using now. And we'll talk about that later in more detail, but I should tell you that there is quite a bit of a difference between the text of the original printing of the 1830 printing and the latest printings that are in use in the today's Mormon Church. We'll get back to that in our next installment next Tuesday. And these are the latest editions that Mormon missionaries used to give away to people and used in their presentations. This was the Book of Mormon that I was first given back in the 1990s. And this is the 1981 edition. And this is the most recent 2004 edition, which was printed by the Doubleday. So you see that they've changed the book cover and it looks a little bit different. Okay, this is the table of contents for the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is not a singular text, at least not according to the official Mormon story. According to the Mormons, it is a compilation of historical books, historical narratives written by the prophets of the old, pretty much like the Bible is. Unlike the Bible, which of course has 66 books, the Book of Mormon has only 15. And the first book of Nephi, which is the first book in the Book of Mormon, was written sometime at the end of the 6th century before Christ. And the last book, which is the Book of Moroni, was written about 400 years after Christ. So the whole time span of the Book of Mormon, according to the official version, is about 1,000 years. And this book, which is called Third Nephi, is pretty much the time when, according to the official Mormon history, Christ, resurrected Christ, visited the American continent. So you have a mention of Christ, actually a whole story about Christ visiting American continent in that particular book, Third Nephi. And we'll talk more about these books in a few minutes. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Book of Mormon storyline. The whole thing starts at about 600 BC. In Jerusalem, there lives a prophet, a man of God called Lehi. He's a righteous man, and this, of course, happens several years before the fall of Jerusalem. So the Lord speaks to Lehi and warns him about the coming doom. And Lehi tries to warn his neighbors, the Jewish people. They wouldn't listen. Actually, they became angry at Lehi for speaking the truth. And so Lehi has to take his family and another family that wants to go with him, and he flees the city. When he flees the city, he goes down south, and this is the official explanation of the Mormon Church as it is now. He goes down south along the Red Sea, and he comes to the southern shore of the Arabian Peninsula, and there he finds this place which is called Bountiful. There his family builds a boat, and according to commandment of God, they have to use this boat to actually go to the Western Hemisphere, to the continent which we call the Americas. Unfortunately, nobody really knows how they did it. There are two basic versions, or two basic routes that Lehi and his family could have taken. One is going from this southern shore of the Arabian Peninsula around African continent and all the way up to Florida. And the other version, which is also current among the Mormons and is equally cannot be proven. They sat on their boats at the southern shore of the Arabian Peninsula, and then they went around India, around the Indonesia, and all the way across the Pacific Ocean to Central America, pretty much to those places where we have the ancient Indian civilizations. And when you look at the maps that Mormons provide to illustrate the settlements of those ancient tribes in Americas, you also have two versions. If Lehi and his family went across the Atlantic Ocean, around Africa, across the Atlantic Ocean to around the Florida Peninsula, then those people, they settled the territory of the current United States. If they went the other direction, across the Pacific Ocean, the theory is that they actually reached the Central America, and this Central American region where the ancient Indian civilizations were located is actually the territory where the events of the Book of Mormon happen. This seems to be more in accord with the current Mormon apologetics, because in many ways they try to point to the ancient Indian American constructions and cities, and they would say that these are the remains of the Book of Mormon civilizations. But the place where Joseph Smith would eventually find the golden plates, which he used to translate the Book of Mormon, were actually found all the way up here in the North America. So this picture, or this map, would coincide better with the actual later history of the Mormon Church. But again, we don't really have any way to ascertain which map is correct, because there's simply not, well, I'd say no archaeological or historical evidence for the people of the Book of Mormon, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit later. Upon settling in the Western Hemisphere at the Americas, the sons of Lehi divided between themselves, and basically the two heroes, or the two antagonists, arose. One of them was the eldest son of Lehi, Laman, and the youngest son of Lehi was the other one of Lehi. His name was Nephi. Nephi was the righteous man. He was trying to serve God the best he can. And Laman was pretty much an unbeliever. He didn't really want to follow God in his ways, and he was pretty much a bad man. And so each of these sons of Lehi gave beginning to a whole race or a whole tribe of people called Nephites and Lamanites. And for the next 600 years, between Nephites and Lamanites, there was a constant struggle. These tribes that descended from two blood relatives, brothers, they actually fought against each other. After Jesus Christ appeared at the Middle East, and he completed his earthly ministry. He was murdered, he died, he raised again, and appeared to the apostles, disciples in Jerusalem, in the Eastern Hemisphere. He also made his appearance in the Western Hemisphere because he wanted also to organize his church there. So when Jesus, after his resurrection, according to the official Mormon story, appeared in the Americas, he appeared to the Nephites, and he also elected 12 disciples to be his representatives in the Americas, pretty much like he elected 12 apostles to be his representatives in the West. And so after Jesus has come to Americas, Nephites and Lamanites made peace, and for about 200 years, they lived in peace with each other, and then the struggle began all over again. And Nephites were on the edge of the total death, like they were being killed out. One of the last prophets of the Nephites, whose name was Mormon, took the books of the prophets of old and condensed them, shortened them, and put them on a golden plates. And then he hid those golden plates on the hill named Cumorah. And his son, Moroni, who was the last living leader of the Nephite tribe, he added a little bit more books to that collection, and also hid those golden plates on the hill Cumorah. So since Mormon was the last prophet of the Nephite tribe, the book is called the Book of Mormon. But Moroni, who was the last leader, will have to play a very important role a little bit later in the modern history of the Mormon Church, and we'll come to that in a few minutes. So here you have the Mormon the prophet creating a set of golden plates and burying them on the hill Cumorah. And Moroni, about 400 AD, buries the rest of the golden plates at the same spot. So let's talk about the modern history of the Book of Mormon. In 1823, Moroni, that same personage, he was already dead, so he appears to Joseph Smith, the originator, the first prophet of the Mormon Church, as an angel. He appears to Joseph Smith and tells him about the golden plates. But Joseph Smith, although he was commissioned to translate those golden plates, he was not permitted to do it in 1823. According to the Mormon story, he would go to the Hill Cumorah pretty much every year, trying to retrieve the plates, but he would not be permitted to do that. Only in 1827, he was permitted to finally retrieve the plates and begin the translation. Here you have the old photo of the Hill Cumorah. This is the actual geographic place that is located in the upstate New York, which is pretty much away from Florida and especially the Central America. But anyway, this is the place where, according to the Mormon history, those golden plates were buried and where Joe Smith found them. That's where the modern history of the Mormon Church has begun. In several years, mother of Joseph Smith, Lucy Mack Smith, narrated a story about these events, and that's how she described what happened on that day. The plates were secreted about 3 miles from home. Joseph, on coming to them, took them from their secret place and, wrapping them in his linen frock, placed them under his arm and started for home. After proceeding a short distance, he thought it would be more safe to leave the road and go through the woods. Traveling some distance after he left the road, he came to a large windfall. And as he was jumping over the log, a man sprang up from behind it and gave him a heavy blow with a gun. Joseph turned around and knocked him down, then ran at the top of his speed. About half a mile further, he was attacked again in the same manner as before. He knocked down this man down in like manner as the former and ran on again. And before he reached home, he was assaulted the third time. In striking the last one, he dislocated his thumb, which, however, he didn't notice until he came within sight of the house, when he threw himself down in the corner of the fence in order to recover his breath. As soon as he was able, he rose and came to the house. Lai was still altogether speechless from fright and the fatigue of running. So you have pretty much a thrilling story of a young guy, and he was really a young guy, still in his older teens, running away from the robbers who trying to steal those precious golden plates from him. We really don't know how those people came to know that Joseph Smith dug the golden plates out, but still they obviously wanted to rob him of the golden plates. But the thing is that the Mormon story, or at least in the documents written by Joseph Smith, we have the exact dimensions of that stack of golden plates that Joseph Smith was given on that day. And if we calculate the weight of that stack of golden plates, this story becomes absolutely unbelievable. This stack should be so heavy that not just a young boy, but no ordinary human would be able to run several miles towards his home, jumping over logs and fighting away thieves with one of his hands. And actually, one of the American apologists, his name is Bill McKeever, he does a very nice explanation of this when he goes out to different Mormon events, especially to the opening of the new temple. I will use about 5 minutes to let him speak for himself and explain what these golden plates really look like and why this is a big problem for the Mormons. Let's listen to him.
What we have here is a replica set of gold plates. Of course, mine are made out of sheet metal. But anyway, this is the size that Joseph Smith said the plates were. They were 6 inches by 8 inches by 6 inches deep. If the plates were in fact that size and were made of gold, as many of the people that are here actually believe, because I do ask them, do you believe that Joseph Smith had gold plates? They say yes. Do you believe the plates were actually made of the metal gold? They say yes. I asked them, well, how heavy would those plates have been? Most of them don't know, other than they would have been heavy. The problem, of course, is that gold weighs 1,204 pounds per cubic foot. The size of the plates that Joseph Smith gives us means that the plates were actually 1/6 of a cubic foot. If you do the math, that means the plates, if they in fact were made of gold, would have weighed 200 pounds. It's an impossibility for a human to carry 200 pounds the way Joseph Smith allegedly carried the plates from where he had them in a hollow log to the place where his home was 3 miles away. According to the story, Joseph Smith takes the plates from their hiding place, he wraps them in a linen frock, he tucks them under his arm, and he proceeds to head home about 3 miles away. On the way, he decides to get off of the main road, and as he gets off the main road, as he's jumping over a log, according to the story, which is found in correlated LDS manuals, he was hit by a man with a gun. He gets into a scuffle with this man, and then he proceeds to knock the man down and then run away at the top of his speed. He goes down the trail a little bit farther, and the same thing happens again. He gets into another scuffle. He knocks the man down in the same way, and he's able to run again at the top of his speed away from this attacker. It happens a third time. This time, when he's fighting off the attacker, he dislocates his thumb. Then he finally gets to his house, which is 3 miles away. The question is, if the plates were really made of gold, how could Joseph Smith, who would have been a young man of around 22 years of age, been able to carry 200 pounds under his arm and do all those things? Jump over a log, fight off attackers, knock them down in such a way, and then run away so that they can't catch him to steal the plates from him. It's a physical impossibility. Now, many of the Mormons around here, when they hear that story, the first thing they'll say is, well, Joseph Smith was a buff farm boy. He probably was, but he wasn't that buff, and there's no way that he could have physically had done what the story actually says he did. The next time, when they realize that he couldn't have been strong enough to do that, the next story is well, it must have been a miracle. The problem is there's no miracle associated with this story. You won't find any Mormon apologists saying that God intervened to give him the strength, or by the Spirit he was able to do such an incredible feat. In fact, one evidence, I think the strongest piece of evidence against the so-called supernatural intervention theory, and that God actually performed a miracle through Joseph Smith, are Mormon apologists themselves. Because most Mormon apologists that you read, they really don't even believe the plates were made of gold. Instead, they'll say that the plates were probably made of an alloy called tembaga, which is primarily made of copper, but at least has to have some gold in it to keep the copper from forming electrolysis with the gold. Gold is really the only metal that could withstand being buried as long as these plates allegedly were buried. No other metal could do that. So there has to be gold mixed in with the metal. And what they try to do is they say that the plates, being made of tembaga, would have certainly been much lighter than gold plates. And then they have to arbitrarily add airspace between the plates, as much as 50% air gap in between the plates, to try to get the plates down to a manageable level. And many of them think that the plates were probably only about 53 pounds. There's a lot of problems with this. First, by trying to get the weight down to a manageable level, what they are in fact doing is admitting that there was no miracle involved. Because if there was a miracle involved, why not leave it at 200 pounds and just leave it at that? But they don't. And the reason they don't is because they know there's no miracle in this story. So they must somehow try to get the plates down to a manageable level. The lightest they get the plates down is about 53 pounds. And many Mormon apologists think that's light enough to do what Joseph Smith did. But even 53 pounds would be incredibly hard to do. I have a set of plates here. These are 53 pounds. And if I could get Mormons to try and reenact it, let them see if they can carry these plates for 3 miles. And even we'll throw in somebody to chase them every once in a while, see if they can reenact it. They can't do it. They probably wouldn't do it. Because once you can prove that this story is not true, It proves there was no Book of Mormon, and it proves that Joseph Smith was not a true prophet of God. Mormons know that the stakes are really high when it comes to this story.
Okay, I hope you could hear his Bill's narration. And this is really an incredible testimony to the human origin of the Book of Mormon and the problems that are associated with the modern history of this book. Oops.
What we have here is a replica.
So upon receiving the golden plates and somehow getting them to his place, Joseph Smith commenced to translate them. And then we face another surprise. In the process of translation, Joseph Smith allegedly did not have to look at the golden plates at all. According to different stories, these plates would lie someplace in his room covered with a linen, like on the picture that you see on your left. Or there was what he actually did, he was looking at a seer stone, some kind of a magic stone that he used to manipulate to find hidden treasures as a young person. Or according to a different version, there were two stones attached to the golden plates called Urim and Thummim, and they were the special stones designed for the translation of these golden plates. Of course, the biblical Urim and Thummim, they didn't have anything to do with the translation. They were the stones attached to the priests' garments. And so all the transcribers or the scribes that Joseph Smith used to actually put down the text of the Book of Mormon, they weren't able to see the golden plates. They would either see the stack of something covered with linen, or as you see on the picture that's on your right, they were separated from Joseph Smith by a wall of cloth, so they would not be able to see the golden plates itself. And according to the most common description, Joseph Smith would place the seer stone in the hat, and then he would lower down his face into that hat, and the words would appear on the surface of the stone, and he would dictate those words to the scribe, who would write those words down and repeat them back to Joseph Smith. This process would go back and forth until the scribe had all the words down correctly. So that description actually is designed to tell us that the whole translation was done by the power of God, that man has really nothing to do with that. And here is a description that we get from one of the scribes, David Whitmer, the man who actually participated in transcribing the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith would put the seer stone into a hat and put his face in the hat, drawing closely around his face to exclude the light. And in the darkness, the spiritual light would shine. A piece of something resembling parchment would appear, and on that appeared the writing. One character at a time would appear, and under it was the interpretation in English. Brother Joseph would read off the English to Oliver Cowdery, who was his principal scribe. And when it was written down and repeated to Brother Joseph to see if it was correct, then it would disappear, and another character with the interpretation would appear. Thus, the Book of Mormon was translated by the gift and power of God, and not by any power of man. If this description is correct, then the question arises, why do we have all the corrections to the text of the Book of Mormon? Why the original manuscript is different from the printer's manuscript, and why the printer's manuscript and the first printing of the Book of Mormon is in many places different from the text as we have it today. And then we have another description given by Joseph Smith's wife, Emma Hale Smith, who was also allegedly used by Smith as his scribe. When my husband was translating the Book of Mormon, I wrote a part of it as he dictated each sentence, word for word. And when he came to proper names he could not pronounce, or long words, he spelled them out, and while I was writing them, if I made any mistake in spelling, he would stop me and correct my spelling, although it was impossible for him to see how I was writing them down at the time. Even the word Sarah, he could not pronounce at first, but had to spell it, and I would pronounce it for him. So again, the description suggests that the scribe was making sure that the text he transcribes was written correctly. And that again raises the question, why do we have all these differences between the manuscripts and between the first edition and the later edition of the Book of Mormon? One of the questions that people usually ask is if the Book of Mormon is not the book from God, if it was not translated by the power and gift of God, if it was not a God-given text, how could a young provincial boy with almost no education create this text all by himself? There are different stories that help to explain how the Book of Mormon could have been created by Joseph Smith himself, but here's a story narrated by his mother, Lucy Mack Smith. And please note this, that these events she's talking about, they happened in 1824. That is 3 years before Joseph Smith was even given the golden plates to translate to begin with. So what she describes is happening when Joseph Smith was not in possession of the golden plates, and he wasn't even able to read their contents. So here's the affidavit, the witness of Joseph Smith's mother. During our evening conversations, Joseph would occasionally give us some of the most amusing recitals that could be imagined. He would describe the ancient inhabitants of this continent, their dress, mode of traveling, and the animals upon which they rode, their cities and their buildings, with every particular. He could describe their mode of warfare as also their religious worship. This he would do with as much ease, seemingly, as if he had spent his whole life with them. On the 22nd of September, 1824, Joseph again visited the place, that is the hill Cumorah, where he found the plates the year before, and supposing that the only thing required in order to possess them until the time for their translation was to be able to keep the commandments of God. And again, he was denied the right to dig the plates out and to begin translating. That will only happen in 3 years. So we have a testimony of his mother that Joseph Smith, without having the golden plates, was already able to create out of his mind, sitting by the fire in his place, these stories of the continents and people and cities and warfare and religion and whatever else. So he was a really young man with a very vivid, illustrious imagination. And on the left, you can see the actual page from the testimony, the history of the Lucy Mack Smith. The whole facsimile of her testimony, her history, could be found on the web if you want to read that for yourself. And then we come to a really interesting part of this modern story of the Book of Mormon. When the whole thing started, Joseph Smith was residing here in the upstate New York, near the city called Palmyra, on the farm that belonged to his parents. And the hill Cumorah is also located in the vicinity of Palmyra. Then, when he was given permission to translate the plates, because of some hardships, he had to move down south to the city of Harmony, where parents of his wife, Emma Smith, lived. And a farmer who lived in Palmyra, his name was Martin Harris, offered his assistance in transcribing the plates. And Martin Harris and his wife Lucy, they also gave some money to Joseph Smith to aid with the translation. But because Joseph Smith moved down south, and that's quite a way from Palmyra, over a time, Lucy became suspicious with her husband, and she wanted to have some proof that he's actually working on transcribing the golden plates and not engaged in some kind of affair. At some point, she would actually go to Harmony, to the place where Joseph Smith lived, and would be looking for the golden plates, but wasn't able to find them. And Joseph Smith, when asked, explained that the golden plates were hidden somewhere in the nearby woods because he didn't really need their presence for the process of translation. Again, as we remember, he was translating of the Assyrian stone, not from the plates themselves. But still, Lucy was insistent. She wanted to see some proof that her husband is engaged in a translation. And so Martin Harris asked several times a permission from Joseph Smith to actually show the golden plates to his wife, and was denied. And then he came to Joseph Smith and asked his permission to show his wife the 116 pages of the transcript that has already been done by that moment. And for some strange reason, Joseph Smith agreed, but on a condition that Harris would only show these 116 pages to 5 select individuals, his relatives, and to nobody else. And he actually made Harris to make a solemn oath to swear that he will never show these pages to anybody else. But for some reason, when Martin Harris went back to his wife's quarters, he would show, according to the history, he would show these pages to pretty much anybody who would come to his house. And eventually, those 116 pages disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to them. This was a very hard time for Joseph because his child just died right after his birth, and so he was very distressed when he came to Palmyra looking for Martin Harris and those 116 pages of the translated text, and he was very outraged when he learned that this translation disappeared. You would imagine that for a prophet, having the golden plates, it would be a trivial thing to go back and retranslate the text because you have everything you need to do that. But supposedly, the Lord told Joseph that if you do the translation again, those evil people who stole the manuscript, they would introduce some subtle changes and produce the changed version, and will tell everyone that you're a poor translator, that you can't translate the text the same way 2 times, at least 2 times. And so according to the wisdom of God, there was another set of plates, which was called the small plates of Nephi, that was prepared beforehand, 600 years before the birth of Christ, especially for this occasion. And Joseph Smith later would be given permission to translate that set of small plates instead of the lost portion of the major golden plates, or the large plates of Lehi, as they were known at that time. This is a very strange story. And actually, if you look at the first portion of the Book of Mormon, which is supposed to be those small plates of Nephi, you'll see that compared to the rest of the Book of Mormon, you don't see as many names, places, descriptions of wars, and other specific events. And 2 long-time, actually lifetime researchers of the Mormonism, Gerald and Sandra Tanner, they wrote an article which is called A Black Hole in the Book of Mormon. It was back in 1989. And basically in that article, they tell that using the computer, they would discover some very strange peculiarities in those early chapters of the Book of Mormon that would be a replacement for those lost 116 pages. And Mormons responded with a series of articles. And actually, here is a link to an article written by a Mormon historian, Ara Norwood, Review, Jordan Center Tenor, covering up the black hole in the Book of Mormon, 1991. I have put the two links here so that you can look up this article for yourself and decide if the Mormon explanation holds any water. As far as I'm concerned, the explanation of that Gerald and Senator Tanner provide is pretty much convincing. What they say is that when Joseph Smith suddenly lost those 116 pages of the translated manuscript, he suddenly realized that he cannot reproduce his creation again. And he just simply does not remember all the names, all the dates, all the places, all the details. And so if by some chance that lost manuscript would reappear in any time, in any next years, it would be obvious to everybody that Joseph Smith created the text instead of translating some ancient golden plates. So he had to come up with a story about the small plates that would be a replacement for the actual lost portion of the golden plates as delivered to him in the at first. Witnesses to the Book of Mormon. This is another interesting part of the story. When Joseph Smith completed the translation, Angel Moroni came again and took away the plates. So the Mormon Church cannot produce the plates to prove that that artifact actually existed. We don't have the proof that any proof that the Mormon Church is founded upon some real thing. And in order for the Mormon religion to be able to have some testimony, according to the official Mormon story, those golden plates were shown to a number of witnesses on two different occasions, actually on several different occasions, but let's say on two different occasions. The first group consisted of 3 people, and you can see the picture on the left, and the other group consisted of 8 people. And here you have the list of these people. 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon were Oliver Cowdery, that's the principal scribe that Joe Smith used to produce the transcript of the Book of Mormon, David Whitmer, the other scribe that he used, and Martin Harris, that guy who lost the 116 pages of the lost manuscript. And actually, if we go a little bit back, when Martin Harris lost those pages, Joseph Smith received a revelation. And in that revelation, God had some very bad things to say about Martin Harris. So here's Doctrine and Covenants, another standard work or another scripture of the Mormon Church, section 3, and verses 12 and 13. And when thou deliveredst up that which God had given thee sight and power to translate, thou deliveredst up that which was sacred into the hands of a wicked man, which is Martin Harris, who has set at naught the counsels of God, and had broken the most sacred promises which were made before God, and has depended upon his own judgment and boasted in his own wisdom. So you have this man whom God calls a wicked man, who has set at naught the counsels of God and broken his promises given before God. You see this man actually acting as one of the witnesses to the Book of Mormon, which is really strange as far as I'm concerned, but anyway. And also you have another 8 witnesses, and if you look at their names, you'll see that 4 of them were the blood relatives of David Whitmer, and the other 4 were the blood relatives of Joseph Smith himself. So among those witnesses, you don't have any independent people, any independent sources, people from the outside who would be really trustworthy, really credible as witnesses. All of these people were closely engaged in the Mormon religion, and they have a vested interest in the success of Joseph Smith affair, his plans and his ideas. So when we look at these witnesses, we can see several interesting facts. Many statements given by the witnesses indicate that they only saw the angel and the plates in a visionary experience. In other words, pretty much none of the witnesses can actually say that they saw the plates. Some of them only saw them in a vision. Other people would see something covered with a linen, and they were allowed to touch that with their hand. So they would touch something that resembled the golden plates, but they would not really see the golden plates, which is quite strange for the witnesses. Like many people in the 1800s, witnesses to the Book of Mormon, they believed in magic, dreams, divination, etc. Martin Harris, that man we talked about a little earlier, he was especially known for his visions and obsession with supernatural. He would receive visions all the time and talk about seeing some supernatural things all the time. All the witnesses had close ties to Joseph and his family. Some were his close relatives. By 1847, all surviving witnesses had left the church. Some of them returned. For example, Cowrie and Harris returned to the church pretty much on their deathbed. They would die soon afterwards. David Whitmer, one of the three witnesses, one of the key persons in the history of the Book of Mormon, would never return to the church. Nevertheless, all of them stood by their testimony that they actually saw the golden plates and remained faithful in that respect. But David Whitmer wrote a letter that was called A Letter to All Believers in the Book of Mormon. And in that letter, he would say, if you believe that God spake to us three witnesses by his own voice, then I tell you that in June 1838, God spake to me again by his own voice from the heavens and told me to separate myself from among the Latter-day Saints. And he would actually say that the Mormon leadership has changed the God-given doctrine and they would not be faithful to God anymore. That was the reason why he left the church. And I believe some of those witnesses were actually excommunicated by the Mormon church afterwards, and Joseph Smith later called them liars, counterfeiters, thieves, and other pretty bad names. So if you would like to know more about this, here's the link provided to one of the really interesting sites with information on Mormonism. And what is interesting about this particular site is that it is done by the ex-Mormons, but these people, they try to be very objective, so they give a voice to both sides. They provide information from the critical side and from the Mormon side. So they actually try to paint as complete picture as possible. And for example, this particular page that talks about the story of the Book of Mormon witnesses is very interesting and full of information that needs to be pondered, that needs to be accessed and somehow digested if you really want to understand if the Book of Mormon is a human creation or a book from God. What Mormons actually claim about the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith himself is known to say this: I told the brethren that the Book of Mormon was the most correct of any book on earth and the keystone of our religion. And a man would get nearer to God by abiding by its precepts than by any other book, including the Bible. Why is that? Because according to the official articles of faith of the Mormon Church, the Bible was corrupted because of mistakes done by scribes and translators. The Bible is not as it used to be. The text is corrupted. And so the 8th article of faith of the Mormon Church, they have 13 statements that they call the articles of faith. The one under number 8 says, we believe the Bible to be the word of God as far as it is translated correctly. We also believe the Book of Mormon to be the word of God. Of course, those of you who are familiar with some cultic translation of the Bible would think that this formulation is proper, because there are some really awkward and outlandish translations of the Bible. But what the Mormons actually meant by this is that who knows if there's even one verse in the Bible that escaped corruption by human hand. And that's pretty much an exact quotation from one of the first apostles of the Mormon Church, Orson Pratt. So what Mormons actually want to say by saying that the Bible is not translated correctly is that we don't have the text of the Bible anymore as it had come from the hands of the original writers. Unlike the Bible, the Book of Mormon, as they say, is absolutely correct. It is trustworthy. It is the keystone of their religion. And that's how they look at it. I believe it was the fourth president of the Mormon Church. His name was Wilford Woodruff. During one of his speeches, he would place the Book of Mormon, one copy, on one side of the table, and a stack of other books on the other side of the table. And he said that if you place these books in such order, the Book of Mormon would outweigh every other book that's in existence. So that's pretty much what Mormons think of the Book of Mormon. This quotation comes from a book written by a Mormon apostle, one of the most theologically minded apostles of the Mormon Church. His name was Bruce McConkie, and his book was called The Mormon Doctrine. Amongst all the doctrines of the gospel, almost all the doctrines of the gospel are taught in the Book of Mormon with much greater clarity and perfection than those same doctrines are revealed in the Bible. Anyone who will place in parallel columns the teachings of these two great books on such subjects as the atonement, plan of salvation, gathering of Israel, baptism, gift of the Spirit, miracles, revelation, faith, charity, or any of 100 other subjects will find conclusive proof of the superiority of the Book of Mormon teachings. Actually, I totally disagree with this. So if you take time to read the Book of Mormon, I think you will agree with Mark Twain, the quote that I quoted in the beginning of our presentation, much more than what Bruce McConkie is in this particular quotation. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're running out of time that we've agreed upon. Okay, let's stop here then, and we'll pick it up from this particular place next Tuesday. We'll talk about whether there are any predictions of the Book of Mormon in the Bible, and we'll talk about the particular contradictions, internal contradictions in the Book of Mormon and contradiction between the Book of Mormon and the Bible. If there are any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them.
Thanks, Dima. You can, if you want to, you can stop this the screen share now if you'd like.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, thanks, Dima. I think that was very informative on the history and some of these aspects regarding the Book of Mormon. Now, there is a question which is more aimed at sort of a practical side on engaging Mormons.
Okay.
So the question is how. It's stated in Afrikaans, so I just want to figure out how to phrase it into English for you.
Okay.
It's basically how can you identify Mormons, and what's the best way to engage with them practically if you were to meet one?
By identify, the person who is asking means how to identify them in real life, or how to identify them in terms of if they're Christians?
I think it's more of identifying them in real life. Like, how do you know someone is a Mormon?
Okay, well, first of all, Mormons do not have hoofs and other satanic attributes. So, when they walk nearby in the street, you would not be able to recognize them if they do not wear special attire. But if a Mormon is a missionary, then normally he has a special badge which says sister such and such or elder such and such. And it also says the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So if we're talking about the Mormon missionary, then he usually wears a very strict attire and has a badge that says that he's a missionary. Well, in Russia, they stopped using those badges because of the Russian regulations. But in many other countries, I believe they still do. So you would be able to recognize the Mormon missionary pretty easy. Otherwise, you would have to ask. Unless you see a person coming out of the Mormon church or actually, carrying around the Book of Mormon or hearing him or her say that she or he is a Mormon, I don't really know of any special way to identify a Mormon from his appearance or her appearance. How to engage a Mormon? Really, I think that one of the key things or key advice that I would give to anybody who wants to engage any cultist would be to ask questions. And there's a really nice book, actually a great book, written by, it's called Tactics. Tactics, and it's written by Greg Koukl. I believe it is available for free from some websites. And you can look it up, and he is not writing especially about the Mormons, but he is giving you a strategy of how to use questions to actually convey some truth to people you talk to, even if you don't know what they believe in. That's the catch about this whole idea of tactics. But really, if you do know something about Mormonism, then probably the best thing you can do, and again, not only Mormons, it also goes for pretty much any cultist. If you want to help a cultist, one of the first things you need to do is to get him thinking. You need to somehow make him ask questions and look for the answers, because unless he begins to think for himself, then nothing would pretty much happen. You can throw any number of proofs or any number of facts at him, but if he is not engaged, if he does not digest what you say, if he does not think it over, then these facts would not work. They would not help. So basically, I would suggest that if you study some basic literature on Mormonism, on Jehovah's Witnesses, and this should be a really credible literature, really trustworthy literature, the one that gets the facts correctly. It might be simple, but it should get the facts correctly. Based upon those facts, you can ask questions. And the goal of asking questions is to actually try to make these people think. So what I would do in many cases talking to Mormons, I would use one of those particular strange features of their history, or I would point them to some of the discrepancies in their scriptures, or I would point them to some difference between the Christian theology and the Mormon theology, and invite them to explain to me why would that be if they call themselves Christians. And that is a really good conversation starter, because once they begin thinking, then you can go on from there. But again, there's no standard way of converting a Mormon or a Jehovah's Witness or somebody else. There is no standard question that is, like a 100% win. Otherwise, there'll be no Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses around. So you have to actually start from a person you're talking to. If there's so much that you know about the Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, like you've read only one book, or one particular fact about that religion, just take the initiative. Ask the question based upon that particular fact. if you give the initiative over to the Mormon, he might be able to ask the question about something that you don't really know, that you have no idea about. And then you would be in a very tough situation, tough position. So take the initiative and try to stay within those limits that you're safe within, that you really know, that you can really discuss. And even if you know a little bit about them, that's enough to ask questions. And if you get a good answer, well, great, then you can go back and study a little bit more. There's no need to, hit a goal every particular time. Sometimes you have to retreat and study more in order to come back and be more effective. That's a normal thing.
Cool, thanks, Dima. I think that's another lecture in and of itself, which you just addressed, the whole thing of counter-cult apologetics or evangelism. Just maybe next time you can come and do a lecture on that, because I think that also opens everything you just said is just scratching this. It's barely scratching the surface of another lecture entirely and another topic entirely.
Yeah, but actually, you might want to have Greg Koukl himself do the presentation. He's much better than me.
All right, Dima, here's another question. On what basis does the Mormon Church believe that the Bible translations have been corrupted?
First of all, there's a statement in the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon itself says that you have this corrupted religion that has corrupted the Bible. And there are actually two statements. One of them is, do you really believe that there is only the Bible and that you don't need anything but the Bible? And the other statement is that because of the scribes and translators, a lot of precious things have been lost from the Bible. So it's not the way it is anymore. So really, it is a revelation in the Book of Mormon. They don't really need to go any further. They try to add some rational arguments, like they would point to some books that are mentioned in the Bible, but that are not in the biblical canon, I don't know, the Book of the War of the Lord, or some other Old Testament books that are mentioned in the Old Testament. But actually, if you look at the Book of Mormon, you also find the names of the books that are mentioned, but are not present in the Book of Mormon. So according to that same standard, the Book of Mormon does not work as well. So it's pretty much a double standard. Of course, Mormons are familiar with the text criticisms, so they will bring up the discrepancies between the manuscripts if they know that stuff well enough. Not all Mormons are very well versed on that particular thing, but if they do, they'll bring that up. But interesting thing is that when you look at the discrepancies in the biblical manuscripts, what Christians do, they try to go all the way back to the original manuscript to make sure that the text that we use now is as close to the original writing of the apostles as possible. What Mormons do, they actually keep adding and changing the text, so that, as I mentioned, the original manuscript is different from the printer's manuscript, and the printer's manuscript is different from the text that they use today. And we'll talk about the very interesting project that Mormons themselves launched. It's a critical textual project to try to locate all the discrepancies in the manuscripts in the Book of Mormon, but that's pretty much unofficial. That's a project run by pretty much two men. They're Mormons, but this is not an official Book of Mormon text. It's pretty much a private project. Very interesting, but private at that.
Cool, thanks, Dima. We have another question here.
Okay.
What are some of the possible motivations for Joseph Smith to make up the Book of Mormon?
I can't really tell, because obviously I was not familiar with the guy, but he might have been looking for a way to create a following. because when he printed the Book of Mormon, soon afterwards he launched the new religion, the Mormonism itself, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It was called differently at that point, but still. So he might have this idea of creating a religion and getting a following and actually monetizing, getting some financial gain from that early on when he started to produce the Book of Mormon. Or there might be a different explanation. He had this fantasy and he had to place it somewhere. It was like boiling inside of him. We've heard the testimony of his mother. The guy was sitting by the fire in his house telling all these tales. Why not writing it down and seeing what's going to happen? So, but at some point in that process, he began talking about himself as the prophet, of God. Actually, as far as I know, the story about his very first encounter with God, which is called the first vision, and there are several versions of that first vision besides the official, so we don't really know what happened. But I believe it became popular much later, sometime in 1840s. So actually, the story of the Mormonism, the early story of the Mormonism, is the story of him obtaining the Book of Mormon. And only later it was added by this God commanding him to be a prophet. So it might have started as a fantasy, but in the process, he became too serious about himself. But again, from the outset, he might have really thought of this as a way of getting some financial profit. I don't know, but there are several explanations. And actually, speaking about financial things, soon after Joe Smith created his religion, he launched a bank in Kirtland and began printing his own money. So financial thing was in there early on in the early history of the Mormon Church. Well, it was not just for fun. It was also about the money.
That's very interesting. Dima, we have one last question.
Okay.
Weren't people skeptical of Joseph Smith's insistence on using the stone to translate the plates?
I believe they were, and I think Lucy Harris, the wife of Martin Harris, was a perfect example of that. She was very skeptical about the whole affair. But the thing is that in the beginning, this whole thing was very contained. I mean, it was not very public. Only a handful of people were involved before the Book of Mormon was actually printed. So whoever was feeling uneasy about Joe Smith using a seer stone, they would have to feel that uneasiness sometime later, like in a backward fashion, like looking at the whole story. And again, now we have a luxury of looking at the history, having all of these records, all of these documents, and as it always has been, contemporaries does not have as good an access to the documents as the later generations would have. So we have a fuller picture than his contemporaries would have. But yes, actually, Joseph Smith was engaged in looking for the hidden treasures with that seer stone. And I believe one of the researchers has found proof in the basement of a local court that Joe Smith was indicted for treasure hunting. So some people on an official level seem to be very concerned with his magical practices.
Okay. Well, thanks, Dima. Then we're all looking forward to next week with part 2, where you're gonna continue with this engagement with the Book of Mormon. So thank you very much for joining us this evening, Dima. So we'll see you next week then, and all the listeners, thank you very much for tuning in. Thanks for the questions. And we'll see you all again next week for the follow-up with Dima and the Book of Mormon.
Okay, goodbye, and God bless you.